Welcome to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How we consume it and how it informs our everyday culture.
I'm Christian Sager, a writer and a designer.
And I'm Charlie Bennett, a librarian and a radio raconteur.
Each episode is us trying to understand the entertainment world that we all live in.
Just a little bit better.
Today's episode is about The Weird and the Eerie by Mark Fisher. This collection of non-fiction essays attempts to define two modes of storytelling by providing examples of each in popular culture. We talk about how Fisher's argument fits into our larger discussions of horror stories, and how his definitions may be useful for considering the end of capitalism.
You can find show notes at patreon.com/supercontext, where you can leave a comment to join the conversation or send us an email at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com. It's really nice, Chris, to have someone suggested to you as an author you should check out, to really enjoy the book and find out that there's more, to get into. And it's doubly wonderful that it's some kind of intellectual, like pop culture intellectual, who's worth the label, Mm-hmm. How did you hear about Mark Fisher? Because you brought this to us.
Yeah, so I've been hearing about Fisher for probably like 5 years now. Various writers that I follow mention him in particular. Warren Ellis is one person who's brought him up a bunch, both this book and Hauntology. And then I believe he talked about, is it capitalist realism or...
Yeah, that's kind of his first monograph, I think.
And Sarah Jaffe is a writer that I follow on social media, and I subscribe to her newsletter. And she mainly writes about the labor movement across the country, but I first became familiar with her because she hosted a panel at South by Southwest about using comics in journalism. And it was pretty interesting. And both of them have talked about Fisher in relation to their work. And I was always mixing him up with another nonfiction writer, actually a guy that we talked about on the show before when we did our Discord episodes, the guy who ran Positive Force in DC. I was like, oh, they're the same person, and they're totally not the same person. So I thought I had read Fisher, and then I realized I hadn't, and then I decided to go hunt this stuff down. And when I saw that The Weird and the Eerie were so in line with what we'd been covering on the show recently, I thought I'd mention it.
Yeah. So I'm in the bag for Mark Fisher and repeater books and zero books also, it turns out.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting tangents to work from here, and it turns out that Fisher and his project and his friends' projects are all kind of intertwined with the things that you and I are interested in. We just, for whatever reason, we didn't stumble across him earlier.
Yeah, this is the party I wish I had gone to.
Well, I will say, one of the things I like about Fisher, and we'll talk about this shortly, but his prose style is easy to consume, right? He tries not to blow your head off with like highbrow philosophical renderings, but he's like adjacent to that crowd. Yeah, and so there's a little bit of that going on.
I'm more into that than you are.
Oh,
I'm a little more taken. If this is sort of the Yngwie Malmsteen of academic writing, I'm a headbanger.
Yeah, you should take like a 4-month class in graduate level discourse theory, and then call me back
and burn it out of me.
Yeah.
There was very little highfalutin academic writing in my MLIS program.
That you're lucky, because a lot of the stuff that he talks about in here is very pertinent to my graduate studies. And in a way, like a lot of the thinkers that he cites are people who I learned about in school and I think are interesting and have contributed great arguments to, the discipline, but their work is purposefully obtuse. One guy, for instance, I think I've brought him up to you before, Ernesto Leclos. He's like a big like Marxist philosophy thinker in that world. I think he passed away recently, actually. And I had to read one of his books in that discourse theory class, and every 10 pages I had to stop and walk away because it felt like my brain was bleeding out of my ears. It felt like I was reading nonsense when there was actually something useful there, but the way it was written was in such a way that made it difficult. That's what's great about Fisher. He's purposely accessible, and he's using examples of pop culture to prove the same points that these folks are proving with very esoteric examples in their own work.
Yeah, he's like a much more mellow Zizek.
Right, yeah. And so I guess we should probably explain what we're talking about. We just like dove right into this episode.
Yeah, I just wanted to get my sort of happy, like, oh, I'm so delighted to have read this book out of the way.
Yeah.
Before our standard disclaimer that Super Context is not a review show. And in particular, this show is not an explainer. We're not doing, this is not a Wikipedia article for the concepts within the book, The Weird and the Eerie by Mark Fisher.
Yeah, we're not going to do like a Cliff Notes to that book for you, right? Go read it. But this is more about like Fisher and his project and how people reacted to it.
Exactly. So, The Weird and the Eerie by Mark Fisher is a nonfiction book. It operates kind of like a collection of essays, especially because it doesn't really come to a big conclusion. It just sort of...
There's no conclusion. It just ends with the last essay. I just finished it today, and I was like, wait, where's the summary?
The Picnic at Hanging Rock essay kind of is a completion. It felt sort of satisfying. But a series of essays or short pieces about the concept of the weird and the eerie as literary devices or concepts in narrative or... artistic tropes or whatever you want to call it. You know, he refers to creators like Lovecraft, H.G. Wells, David Lynch, Philip K. Dick, Nigel Neal, who I'm not familiar with except for what I read in this book, the band The Fall, Daphne du Maurier, and M.R. James.
I've talked to you about Nigel Neal before.
I'm just not familiar though.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, the name, but I don't have. But everybody else there.
Yeah.
I've been deep in their stuff.
And I didn't even there's a bunch of other examples that are in this book that are a little less outside of our wheelhouse. But the other thing that I think is particularly interesting about this book in relation to where we are in the Super Context project is this is a great place to kind of wrap up some of our thoughts about horror after we did 5 episodes related to Lovecraft earlier this year. And it's just in time for Halloween. It's a very cerebral take on Halloween.
Yes.
But it also addresses a bunch of episodes that we've done on this show over the last 3.5 years. So I would say this is related to our Stephen Graham Jones episode, Junji Ito, Grant Morrison, the Twin Peaks episode, definitely Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation, Michael Shea, to a lesser extent, the Wicker Tree and the Wicker Man before it, China Mieville, M.R. James, Laird Barron. He even references True Detective in here a little bit. So there's a decent amount of overlap with things that we've covered before, but he's approaching it in a way that we didn't in those episodes.
Yeah. And True Detective has to be in that list. I mean, simply for me, because that was my jumping off point for weird fiction. And the first time I really got an inventory of weird fiction as a genre of itself, because Nick Pizzolatto, when he was interviewed about influences or, where does this whole kind of cosmic horror, Lovecraftian, weird, spooky feel come from, he laid out a bunch of thinkers who and creators who are sort of the arc of weird fiction. Like he said, no, I'm not so much Lovecraft, but I read Thomas Ligotti's essay, and he mentioned In the Dust of This Planet in those lists, talked about Laird Barron, and so that's why I read Laird Barron to start. And I like the stuff that True Detective has sent me after more than I like True Detective these days.
Yeah, I think weird fiction has a branding problem. that the people who find it, once they find it and figure out that it's a genre, really latch onto it. And
right. It's a thing you can get into.
Yeah. And I think you and I are both people like that, but it is not useful as a genre in the sense that people use for marketing purposes to try to sell books to people.
But they're trying.
They are trying. Yeah. But there hasn't been an agreement really on what it means. And it's a slippery term. And so more people just fall back on Lovecraftian. For what they mean is weird.
Yeah. Let's do a quick survey of how some people have tried to define it. There's a book critic. I think he's LA Times, right? Richard Luckhurst.
Yeah, he's in the LA Review of Books.
LA Review of Books, excuse me. And he wrote this rather misguided sort of summation. He said, "You have probably heard of, quote unquote, the weird by now, but you may not quite know what it is or why so many genre critics, cultural theorists, and philosophers are keen to engage with it." And here's the part that turned me off, that I was sort of, shitting on before I even began. "It might once have been quarantined as a subgenre associated with sullen goths and all those arrested adolescent readers of H.P. Lovecraft, but it has long slithered free of those confines and now leaves a trail not just straight across the internet, but on the page and in mainstream TV shows and movie screens."
That's not so bad.
It's not so bad, but that's a very low bar, Chris.
So this is a term that I've been struggling with for a while now. I think the first time that I ever heard it used was by China Mieville, who we've done an episode about, and we talked about weird fiction in that episode. Yeah. But I actually had a project that I was working on earlier this year. I was thinking about starting a weird fiction magazine that was going to be a combination of comics and prose and art. And I was trying to do what Fisher did in this book before I knew this book existed, really trying to nail it down and figure out like what this meant and how I could solicit submissions based on a genre. And so I pulled together this list conveniently for us that compares all these other people trying to define weird fiction. So here's China Mieville. He called it invoking a radical kind of strangeness. John Clute wrote about it for the Encyclopedia of Fantasy in 1997, and he said, "Weird fiction is the term that is used loosely to describe fantasy, supernatural fiction, and horror tales that embody transgressive material." And then Damian G. Walter wrote about it in an article called "What is the New Weird?" This is where it gets even more complicated because some people are like, "Oh no, I'm weird."
There's Lovecraft and then there's now.
Yeah. So Walter tried to define it as stories that are slipstream, that blend between horror, science fiction, and fantasy. They have to be stories that entertain while also expressing a dissatisfaction and uncertainty about reality. And they are for serious writers of speculative fiction, and the prize has always been the belief that the unrealities of science fiction, fantasy, and horror provide us with unique tools in which to dissect the realities of our world.
So just to put that in other words, that last quote, he's basically saying this is when people who are thinking about stuff and want to confront or interrogate the world, when they mix the tropes of science fiction, fantasy, or horror, they can get at truths that are harder to pin down.
Yeah,
in literary
fiction. I think that's close. Simon Strancis wrote about it. There's actually a series now that's called The Best Weird Fiction of the Year, and every year they publish this anthology. And I believe he wrote about this in the first of those anthologies, which I think he was the editor of. And he said, "The weird is the idea that there is something beyond the world that we know. It's something that we can't understand. And it's an intrinsically terrifying notion that doesn't matter if something means harm to us or not. The mere idea of its existence is existentially terrifying, and fiction that dwells on this notion is by definition horror fiction."
So is that the Bible?
I think in some ways you could qualify the Bible as weird fiction, yeah.
When we were going through the notes for this episode, I had a really like a strong pull towards understanding that this is kind of like what happens to a spiritual desire when someone is logically or thoughtfully atheistic. Like if you're feeling a pull towards some kind of cosmic connection, or feeling a pull towards something supernatural, something outside of yourself, a force, right? Or some kind of deity or connective sort of magic, but you also feel like, but that's not true. It's not true.
Which makes you feel isolated and alone.
You start falling into this sense of, oh, the existence of the void is existentially terrifying. And I have to frame it in some way to make it not just a void.
And there's two writers that you and I have covered on the show before that address this too. Laird Barron approached it. I would say he is probably the one carrying the torch the most for this style of writing. He says, in weird fiction, protagonists glimpse something much larger than themselves, and that's frightening. It's frightening because it is inexplicable, and also because man is an animal not far removed from the cave.
I like that definition, but I do have to say to you, Chris, as a fellow reader, you haven't been reading his new series, have you?
No, you and Michael Wehunt have told me about these crime books, and it just doesn't sound like it's for me. It sounds like Barron is trying to sustain his writing career with something that's a little bit more marketable.
Yeah, well, he's just pulled away from, say, the light is the darkness kind of material, that sort of fever dream stuff.
Yeah.
And it's much more of a hard-boiled, naturalistic, but a grotesque hard-boiled, as opposed to weird fiction. I don't know if this is now his path, if there's maybe short stories happening, but Laird Barron seems to be backing off from that sweet spot.
He does. He's also like crazy prolific, and I get the impression that he's that prolific because he has to be in order to have like a sustainable paycheck. So there's part of me that wonders like if this is what his real path is, as you're saying, or if it's like, let me get a couple of these out. It'll, give me a cushion, and then I can go back to my weird stuff.
Yeah, maybe this is just his blue period.
Could be, right. And then, your favorite and mine, Jeff Vandermeer, who I've mentioned even before we did an episode on him, he and his wife compiled a book all about weird fiction called The Weird, and they have another...
that's the anthology that I found Michael Shea in for that episode.
They have another one that's called The New Weird as well. And Vandermeer in that says, New Weird is a type of urban secondary world fiction that subverts the romanticized ideas and place found in traditional fantasy, largely by choosing realistic, complex real-world models as the jumping-off point for creation of settings that may combine elements of both science fiction and fantasy.
Chris, what the fuck does that mean? Now, my experience with Jeff Vandermeer on social media means that I hear everything he writes now as a kind of bitchy, superior sort of statement.
Yeah.
So I'm coming from a place of bad faith here, but I don't know what that means.
Rather than try to dissect that paragraph, because it feels poorly written to me as well, I will just say that outside of those two anthologies that he and his wife edited, they also host a site called Weird Fiction Review. I think that's the name of it. And basically it serves as a WordPress platform to either host stories that are in this genre or essays that are about this genre. Mm-hmm. And I found that was a really great resource to go to be like, to try to refine my thinking about it. Here's what's fascinating to me, though, and I do want to make this a through line throughout this episode because we've gotten way away from Mark Fisher. Mark Fisher isn't mentioned anywhere on that site.
Right. And in fact, like the turn in this little survey we're doing, Mark Fisher has nothing to do with the fiction of the weird. He is not a novelist or a short story writer
Right.
who tried to do some kind of essay. He is an academic. He was, an academic. He was a theorist, a cultural theorist.
Yeah. And this is one of my problems with weird fiction right now. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do the magazine. I hope I'll get an opportunity to do it someday. But the worlds of intellectuals who are thinking about this, like Mark Fisher, and prose writers like Vandermeer and Barron, and then artists and comics people, all of them are in these disparate pockets that aren't adjacent to each other. And so they're not communicating, and they're not sharing. They don't seem to be sharing their thoughts. Maybe some of them are, but it's not traceable. Like, I'm not seeing it in conversations about this genre or about pushing this discipline in a new direction or anything. And I would love to see them all communicate.
As consumable as the Mark Fisher text is, it's still an academic text.
Yeah.
And there's definitely a rejection that some people are going to have that is immediate and visceral to the language that he uses to talk about stuff they like.
Though, I kept wondering to myself while reading this, surely he and China Miéville must have sat down for a cup of tea at some point, right? Like, they're both English. They're both thinking about capitalism, Marxism, and horror, and how they all intersect. That's a pretty small universe. And I don't know. I couldn't find any evidence that they were really interested in each other.
Well, we should try and find the zine of some conversation that they had.
It would be fascinating if that existed. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about Mark Fisher. We did go a little bit away from him in the beginning of this episode, but that's because the thing that he wrote about has been on our minds, both in the show and out of the show, especially in your case. But let's talk about who Mark Fisher is, the author of The Weird and the Eerie. He was a British writer and cultural theorist. He died in 2017 when he was 48. So he was born in the late 60s. He was known for his blog K-Punk, and he wrote about politics, music, and pop culture from a very sort of learned and academic viewpoint. He was a PhD. He got it from the University of Warwick. He taught as a philosophy lecturer. K-Punk was old. I don't think I had any idea that it had been around since 2003.
Me either. Yeah. I don't know why. I mean, the stuff that he wrote about is like perfectly within the zone of things I'm interested in, and yet I never came across it in my travels on the internet.
This is indicative of a thing that I sometimes worry about, that what I used to think was a strength of being interested in a lot of different things and a lot of different, sort of paths and media and all that, that I've just been, scratching the surface of multiple things as opposed to drilling down on one discourse or medium or whatever. And so I have these gaps of simple sort of pop culture accessible resources that I never connected to.
Well, basically Fisher's trajectory was after he got out of grad school. He was a visiting lecturer, like most post-grads are.
You mean he was exploited, like most postdocs
I don't know if it's the same way over there. But he pretty much found like he wasn't satisfied by it. And so he started K-Punk, and he was really prolific there. That eventually led to him becoming an editor on projects, starting his own publishing company, and then becoming an author himself.
So we have from Vice not a feature, but sort of a discussion of the book and Fisher himself by Johan Koshi.
Yeah, so I want to point out that this is one of those interesting moments where Vice has like a really great article on something smart. Everybody, including myself, tends to be dismissive of Vice as just kind of like, I don't know, meatheads smashing beer cans over their own head.
I have a totally twisted view of Vice because the only time I ever read a Vice article is when you bring it to the research. So I think of Vice
it's usually the good shit.
Yeah, I think of Vice as this sort of thoughtful magazine that every once in a while does a thing about piercings that I have had sex near.
No, I mean, I think it's probably more of that stuff than this stuff. But I'm just always glad to find out that it's a platform that like makes room for things like this. So Johan Kashi wrote this piece about this book.
And here is the sort of attempt to sum up the thesis of the weird and the eerie. And what's interesting to me is that even in this short passage that we're about to read, he gets it wrong a little bit. He gets the argument by Fisher wrong because it is an academic argument that is so hard to translate into any kind of like fast, consumable statement. But Koshy says, the simplest way to distinguish between the weird and the eerie, the late Mark Fisher writes, is to think about the difference between presence and absence. Weirdness is produced by the presence of that which does not belong. It shouldn't or couldn't exist, and yet there it is. Think of the montage techniques of surrealist art, or the fact of Donald Trump's presidency. That's kind of wonderful. And then he says, eeriness, however, is produced when something is absent. And he quotes Fisher. We find the eerie more readily in landscapes partially emptied of the human.
So this is how I started to think about it post-Fisher. The weird is additive, and the eerie is subtractive. You're taking away something that feels necessary.
That's certainly part of it. For me, what I read was that the weird is about challenge, and the eerie is about disorientation. Mm-hmm. The weird is that which should not or cannot be, and yet is. And the eerie is when something is not there that should be there, or something is there that shouldn't be there.
Oh,
like
see, I think it's the other way around. I think the weird is when there's something there that should not be there, and the eerie is when something isn't there that should be there.
Okay. I feel like we could start arguing about semantics, right? I think that we're sort of agreeing with each other, but the shouldn't is where we're sort of falling into a hard place.
Yeah.
So I'll just say that even you and I can't quite agree with how to articulate Fisher's argument, which
and
this is an important piece of understanding this book.
And this is why this genre is like super difficult to define, because even when somebody like him comes along and is like, I got it, I nailed it down, then when everybody else tries to talk about it, it falls apart in their hands.
Yeah, it reads so well. You feel like, oh, I understand completely. And then you try and explain it to someone and they think, you're just saying words.
Oh man, try to explain weird fiction to somebody who doesn't interact with horror in any way. Like has never watched a horror movie, never read a horror book, doesn't want to have anything to do with any of that. If you then try to explain weird fiction to them, it's difficult, because so often we end up falling back on using examples of things that already exist to be like, okay, see that thing? That's the weird thing.
Right. And that's how Mark Fisher's book operates.
Yeah.
So he presents this sort of, here's what I think the weird is, using Lovecraft as a source, but then also thinking about contemporary understandings of things. Mm-hmm. And then here's what I think the eerie is. And now let me show you in pop culture and only slightly older literature how I came to this sort of understanding of weird and eerie. Here are examples. Mm-hmm. And that's why he feels a little bit like Zizek, who will take a bunch of Hitchcock films and be like, so check it out. Here's how we understand Lacan.
Yeah.
So back to Koshy, who gives another sort of summation. Weirdness abounds at the edge between worlds. Eeriness radiates from the ruins of lost ones. So then he starts talking about how the book got written. Fisher's short book of essays, The Weird and the Eerie, is developed from arguments he made on his iconic K-Punk blog, and looks at how the weird and the eerie work their way through popular culture. One of the best essays, Koshy says, is on the post-punk band The Fall, whose music is grotesque in the proper sense, synthesizing human and non-human forms into a gruesome whole.
So this is the second time in like a week that I've learned of grotesque as being an adjective not meaning what I thought it meant.
Oh, nice.
Apparently you can use the term grotesque as a category for fonts. I was unaware of this. I've been a graphic designer for 20 years, and I was like really digging deep trying to find certain kinds of fonts. And I noticed that the ones that I was looking for were all tagged grotesque.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then this, he spends a good amount of time in that chapter trying to define what grotesque means. I don't feel like I fully grasped it, but it seems important to understanding The Fall.
Or not. Do you know that, so I'm friends with one of our patrons, Fred Rasco.
Oh, yeah.
Who is a big fan of The Fall.
I know that person, too. Yeah.
And I read him this bit about The Fall. And I don't want to put words in Fred's mouth, but he basically said, what does any of that mean? That's completely useless when it comes to understanding why The Fall is great.
And that, I think, is one of those moments where Fisher does feel a little too academic, right? And even it may seem less academic-y to you and I, but I think let's point out here, Fred Rasco is a research librarian. Like,
oh yeah,
he works at a university,
not an uneducated man
exactly.
In any way.
But he's like, yeah, no thanks.
So what Fisher tries to unpack out of The Fall is the sort of foregrounding of the recording process that they did on this album, like lo-fi production, quite obvious recording artifacts, right? And then also Marquis Smith's lyrics, which are sort of famously opaque and yet seem to make sense because they do make sense to him. And then what's fundamentally weird about The Fall, what doesn't belong about them, isn't just the form and content of their music, but their very existence. According to, and now here's the Fisher quote, according to official bourgeois culture and its categories, a group like The Fall, working class and experimental, popular and modernist, could not and should not exist. And then Yoshi finishes by saying, here, weirdness is an act of existential defiance against the idea that sophisticated art is only for elites. So this is almost like helping people understand that, when you say that something's weird, that's weird, you're not somehow rejecting Fisher's argument.
Right. Yeah. So think about how often we all use the term weird in our everyday life. And then like if we try to come up with like an agreement on like what does that actually mean, because I think we use it a lot of times where it might not be applicable. He's saying this is one of them where two things that seem to be disparate and shouldn't be together come together, right?
A paradox of character.
The way he describes The Fall is the way that I think you and I ended up thinking about Gang of Four after we did that episode on them. It's a similar kind of thing.
Yeah, a little bit. We're going to finish off. He says, the future will be weird. The future will be eerie. And embracing it will involve a transcendental shock with something extraordinary.
So that's a nice summary. I think it's a little, in some ways, Yoshi's piece simplifies the book, and in other ways, I think, because he's writing for Vice's audience, it's more about music than it is about like a genre of a medium. Maybe talking a little bit more about the publishing project that Fisher was a part of will help us wrap our heads around this.
Yes. You should take all that stuff that we just delivered from Koshy as a kind of a summary or a taste of the work that's in the book.
So Fisher was also a publisher. He ran two separate publishing imprints, and the one that published this book was called Repeater Books, and this was an imprint that was founded in London by him and the person who still currently runs it, Tariq Goddard. They had previously founded a radical publisher that was called Zero Books, with several other people. I think there was like 3 or 4 other people involved. But they all resigned from Zero after they had disagreements with their parent company, which was John Hunt Publishing. And so then Fisher and Goddard went and started Repeater as basically like, this is where we're going to take our business now.
Yeah. So this was essentially a group of people who defined their mission and their plans, and then joined a larger publishing firm to operate within it. So John Hunt Publishing was this company that had the infrastructure, had the resources, so that it wasn't just a group of folks trying to bind books in their living room, right? But then it went sour for them, and they sort of ejected themselves, but they couldn't take Zero Books with them because they had, signed a deal.
Sold the rights, yeah.
Yeah. So Repeater is Zero with a different name.
Yeah, and so this is another thing that's interesting to me about Fisher, right, is that I think anybody who's listened to the show for a decent amount of time knows that I'm attracted to independent media makers. And so Fisher not only is writing about content that I'm interested in and coming up with like intellectual definitions that are also user-friendly for those things, but then he's doing it himself. He has friends that are helping him, but he's not working for a big company. He didn't sell this book to somebody. And Zero was founded with that kind of ethos. So in 2009, they got together and they said their mission was to combat what they saw as a prevailing anti-intellectual trend in contemporary culture. And that seems to me pretty interesting in light of how Fisher's working too, because he's being intellectual, but he's also writing in a way that's, I guess, user-friendly.
Accessible, yeah. This is sort of an attempt to provide ways for people to shake off the kind of anti-intellectualism that comes from, I don't understand it, and it has nothing to do with my life.
Yeah, the way that I described Ernesto Leclos earlier,
yeah, exactly.
Just like this incredibly dense fog of words, even to somebody that's in graduate school and having their hand held through the book, it's still incredibly difficult to wrap your head around. And Fisher's like, let's just get away from all that shit. Like, we can talk about this like 2 people over a cup of coffee,
Yeah. So Tariq Goddard has a blog post somewhere that is an explanation of what happened, why Zero Books became Repeater, or why Zero Books is still with John Hunt Publishing, even though Repeater Books exists. He wrote that, from the start, our affiliation with John Hunt Publishing created procedural problems that quickly became personal. And he lists a number of those. The one that really stuck out to me was John Hunt's preference for electronic systems that bypassed personal correspondence. Mm-hmm. That, I just, part of me loves that was a problem. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Anyway, so they just began to feel like they weren't getting the support that they wanted for the values that they wanted to embody. The discrepancy, he says, between our actual impact in the world and the perception within John Hunt Publishing that we were a drain and encumbrance meant that we were subject to internal attacks that got in the way of our being able to properly fulfill the aims of our project. So capitalism killed Zero Books.
I mean, it sounds like that, yeah.
The monster got them.
It sounds like they signed to a major label, and then they were like, oh, shit, this is terrible. And then
the major label was like, your records are just hard, man. No one likes them, and we're not selling enough.
Yeah.
So Goddard says, as attempts to buy Zero out and move elsewhere failed, departure became our only option. Repeater will take Zero's operating principle to make marginal and excluded points of view mainstream and necessary. So the Zero team left the name at John Hunt and went on to become Repeater. And they said that there was some Zero books that they still were connected to, mm-hmm. and that Repeater would actually promote those books. But eventually, the the queue of 0 books would be not theirs anymore.
They would
right?
like transfer. Yeah, but the books that were in progress with them became repeater books.
I want to read now someone's book about how that happened. I'd be kind of down for a novel based on that particular story.
Yeah, I'm sure there's an interesting backstory in there somewhere, and maybe we will get it someday, but unfortunately it won't be from Fisher. Maybe it'll be from Goodard. Yeah, it's we've been dancing around this. We should just say, like, the reason why we're talking about Fisher in the past tense isn't just because he's gone. He committed suicide.
Yeah, he suffered from depression. He talked about that. He was almost transparent about his mental afflictions, mental difficulties. But yeah, he killed himself before this book came out.
Yeah, right. This was the last book, I believe, that was in queue after he passed away. So this is a book that is, even though it's written by a guy who has like kind of a niche cult following, it's not really big. So there's no trace of numbers, how many copies they sold. There's no awards for this book. There's just reviews.
This is almost like a book published by an academic press.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the way that it is, it's not registered as a bestseller or a not seller. You know, sales figures are just unimportant. And going back to that bit in Tariq Goodard's kind of explanation of what they wanted to do, they said that their impact would be modest but marked.
Interesting.
You know, that they knew that they weren't going to be rich doing this.
Oh, yeah, and I don't get the impression that that was any kind of intention of theirs. Fisher, I still have a lot of Fisher to read, but I get the impression that he had a real, he had the word punk in his blog title. I think he had like a punk ethic system in terms of how he approached his intellectual work. One thing I want to point out again, though, is this is a book that specifically addresses a concern that the literary horror community is constantly going over and over. And it does it pretty succinctly. It's readable. It's not highbrow. It's not cerebral in a way that makes it, unapproachable. And yet hardly any of the pieces that I found in the research for this engage with that at all. The horror community doesn't really recognize this. Instead, most of the pieces were by other people who were like quasi-intellectuals. So that shows this weird gap that they encountered, right? Like they kept trying to make their work accessible and available to people who were into pop culture. And I don't know necessarily that it was as successful as they had hoped.
It didn't jump silos.
Yeah. There were only a couple of blogs that I found by horror people addressing this book, and one of them was the Lovecraft e-zine, which is like it's what it sounds like. It's a collection of short stories and sometimes essays that are Lovecraftian. But most of the folks that we talked about earlier, China Mieville, Jeff Vandermeer, Simon Strancis, I didn't see anything about them engaging with this at all. So they're noticeably absent. I don't think that's a comment on them. It's not like they failed. I'm saying there's for some reason these worlds don't overlap.
Right, despite the engaged, if not obsessive nature of both.
Mm-hmm. So something else that I thought was kind of interesting about this book, right? Like we're reading this book and you and I were kind of like messaging each other back and forth over the last couple of weeks. Like, wow, this book is something else.
Yeah.
But when I stepped back to prep it for the episode, I was like, wow, like even for this, pretty progressive intellectual, Fisher doesn't address representation or diversity at all in here. He doesn't talk about it in relation to the examples that he uses. He doesn't talk about how the weird and the eerie can be applied to different perspectives of the world.
This is the academic nature of it, right? His frame is not gender studies. His frame is not ethnicity studies or whatever the correct way to describe that would be. He is coming from a very like cultural studies, almost postmodern scholar kind of place,
Right.
where the grand narratives are the important ones, and not getting down into the sort of the marginalized groups and their uses of this theory.
Right. Yeah. And grand narrative, I think, is the right way to approach this. I think the reason why he doesn't address that stuff is because he doesn't feel like he has to, because he thinks of the phenomena of the weird and the eerie as being universal, regardless of ethnicity, gender, or sexuality.
I thought about that. I think that's right. That it's his idea is that this is something that is true, kind of whoever you are. You know, the weird is that which should not be. But I think also he kind of knew that the weird for particular people, for particular cultures or backgrounds or viewpoints, what should not be changes from one group to the next.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And I think that often lends to, I don't know how to explain it, like a kind of disconnect in communication. When people use the term weird, they're like, what's weird about that? You know, to them, it makes sense for instance, the Vice article saying that Donald Trump being president is weird, right?
Yeah, and there's going to be some people who are like, feel like the argument fails because, oh, that's your example is, you know, the president.
Yeah. And then, you know, I mean, I'm just thinking about the examples that we mentioned earlier. Most of these examples are white folks, you know, or stories about white folks. Lovecraft, H.G. Wells, David Lynch, Philip K. Dick, Nigel Neal. Daphne du Maurier is the first female writer in the list that I've composed here. There were a number of other female writers, though, that he talked about in this. But I can't think of any that were like specifically stories about identity that weren't white and pretty much male and straight.
Yeah, it's a slim book, and it's clearly a starting point for conversations. And I think that in a perfect world, someone would take this book and then bring it into their academic framework.
Yeah, and continue the discussion.
Yeah, use some of the examples to then frame their own examples and say, so this is perhaps how we can understand how my concerns, my discourse connects to the literary theories of the weird.
Yeah, exactly. I want to see that. Like that's what I'm interested in next. I want to see what people do with Fisher's work and apply it to their own.
I will confess that I have taken the Repeater website or web page that has all the books. I made a PDF out of it, and I am going through the list.
Oh, yeah?
And then in the PDF, I'm crossing out each book as I read it.
Oh, weird. I want to take a look and see what all they've got and what you're working on. I know you're reading that Thacker book, which is important because...
And that's a zero book, just to be, precise, but it's still part of that crew, yeah.
Yeah, so that Thacker thing is important because Thacker is one of the people who really dissected this book. There's a lot here, right? There's... the most of it that I'm looking at that I'm the most interested in is Fisher's, but I'm sure if I dug into these summaries, a history of Gang of Four.
Yeah, like what I thought is what I'll do is I'll use Repeater as the kind of subscription to a label sort of reading experience where even if I don't want to read, or like a podcast, even if I'm not interested in the subject, I'm going to read the next one, the next episode, or the next record that comes to me and just see what I get out of it. And so I've got...
they are prolific too. There are so many books here.
I've got Lean Out ready to go.
Which one is that?
It's a direct response to Lean In.
I don't know what that means.
Lean In is this book that I have not read, but I feel like I've read it at this point because there's been so much talk about it. It's Sheryl Sandberg.
Oh, yeah.
She wrote this book, and there's a subtitle. Let me see if I can find it.
How Facebook Will Take Over the World.
Lean In, Women, Work, and the Will to Lead. She is the chief operating officer of Facebook at this point. And so someone wrote a book called Lean Out, and the cover of it is a hand in a dishwashing glove giving the reader the finger.
Interesting. Well, that seems like as good a place as any for us to stop and take a break. But when we come back, there are a lot of reference points for us to hit to talk about the themes that are in this book and in Fisher's larger work that we think are worth sharing with you all.
Chris, we're going to talk about money.
Which you mean the imaginary thing?
Exactly. Odd for this moment in this podcast about this subject from this particular theorist, but let's talk about how this podcast is able to continue even though it has to spend money on things.
Yes, let's talk about that, because with the money that we get from Patreons, it sounds crass to say money like that, but with that money, we're able to do things like pay hosting fees. We have to pay a company to host the episodes that are up. We have to pay to keep the entire library together. We cover expenses for all the artifacts that we research, right? This was not an easy book to get a hold of, for instance. Right. We mentioned that this was a small publisher.
We also are continuously updating our production equipment and trying to figure out the best way to stay connected to the internet, because it seems like my internet provider would like me to stop doing this podcast.
It seems like your internet provider would like you to switch internet providers.
Yes. We are a Patreon-supported podcast. And if you don't know what that is a platform that allows folks to schedule a monthly donation of some amount to Super Context that goes directly to us so that we can do the stuff we just talked about. And as we get more and more patrons providing more and more donations, we can then look forward to doing more extravagant things like transcripts for the show. Someday we hope to actually create a job for someone to have as part of Super Context. And eventually we can even pay to travel so that we can be in the same room once again, Chris, recording this podcast.
Yeah, we're just asking our patrons to fund our bromance so that like we can physically be in the same space as one another again.
Yeah, do a pod cuddle, you know.
Exactly.
High on green tea and Snickers bars.
You might be thinking, well, wait a minute, I just downloaded this episode and I didn't pay for anything. That's right, because all the episodes are available for free. But if you're one of our patrons, you get access to bonus material. And there's different tiers that you can subscribe to, but you get things like outtakes from the show or blooper reels. You also get bi-weekly bonus mini episodes that we record, and a monthly extra version of Super Context called Super King Context, where we do all Stephen King adaptations. So, for instance, like if you're a person who just found this podcast because you're into horror stuff, there is an entire catalog of Super Context episodes that are about Stephen King horror movies that aren't up on our RSS feed, but you can get access to all of them if you become a patron.
So go to patreon.com/supercontext and you can get a feel for the stuff that's up there. And we have descriptions of all the levels of support you can give. Now, one thing that everybody who is a patron gets, unless they tell us, no, I don't want that, is thanked by name in every episode. And we're going to do that right now. Thank you so much to our patrons, starting with our newest one, Alex Laird. Thank you for joining the community. And thank you to Nick Sage, Pete Bowe, R.M. Rhodes, Rob Sloan, Robert Negoesco, Roman Marichik, and Ron Bilodeau.
Thank you to Ross Llewellyn, Ryan O'Neill, Simon Workman, Thomas Tremberger, Whitney Buchanan, Amit Doshi, Bennett Callahan, Kevin Wetter, Christian Hirvila, and Lee Fowler.
Thank you to Liliana Gill, Lokesh Dakar, Miriam Meany, Misha Moon, Dan Haynes, Dave Jordan, Dave Wachter, and Eilish Phillips.
Thank you to Elijah Tilstra, Evan Mapstone, Fred Rasco, who got a shout-out in this episode, Ira James Udiskin, Beth Barnett, Billy Whitehouse, Brian Chovanich, Carolyn Zoids, Chris Martin, Cliff Landis, and Coco.
Thanks to Joseph Aleo, Carmela Padovich, Kate Sharon, Patrick Malka, Jason Puckett, Jess Staten, and Jill Kaufman.
If you're interested in supporting Super Context beyond the level of listening to the show and finding out about all these other rewards that exist in our community on Patreon, you can visit us at patreon.com/supercontext.
And we're back. So for you and I, the kind of the most important piece of the weird and the eerie is either help understanding the things that are compelling to consume, or help to understand the process or mechanics of work we are trying to create.
Yeah.
I am not compelled to write about the sort of standard subjects of the weird or horror that we've talked about. But that novel that I've been, I guess, wrestling with for a couple of years now, I think in a way it's my weird fiction, not because I'm trying to get the same effect as a lot of the weird fiction that is referenced by Fisher or by you, but because I do want to talk about things that should not be, or I do want to talk about the transgression of one world to the other. But the worlds that I'm talking about are sort of the constructed man-made world.
Yeah, right. You're not incorporating the slipstream stuff.
Right, and the natural world. Like the idea that, oh, my house is a hole in a forest. The trees aren't encroaching on me. I've actually, made a hole in the natural world to have my house kind of ideas. And that's actually kind of a big piece of how people talked about what Mark Fisher was finding in this study, was sort of like how you think about the weird as something separate from horror.
Yeah, and so Elvia Wilk has a great piece up on Literary Hub about this book that is a good point of reference, especially because she is a writer and she didn't realize that she was a weird fiction writer.
Yeah,
and she wasn't familiar with any of the points of identification that Fisher mentions here, or that you and I have been talking about on the show.
But she was able to re-articulate some part of her drive to create through the lens of what Fisher provided.
Mm-hmm.
She wrote that she doesn't care about defining a genre, but, quote, "These terms provide a roadmap for thinking through the kinds of stories that take us toward the black hole. That is, the thing that literally exists, but nonetheless resists linguistic description or cognitive explanation. The thing that dismantles the very tools of signification and representation that fiction depends on. What do you do when you can't truly describe the thing that's important to communicate about?"
Yeah, and that seems like a huge problem if you're a fiction writer. And
Well,
she's
if you're a
trying to
person,
use fiction to induce that feeling in other people.
I mean, if you want to talk about a thing and you say, I don't know exactly how to describe it, right? That's, you're automatically, you're in the hole. You're not going to be able to connect to other people about the thing that's bothering you.
Are you familiar with a writer named Karen Russell?
I'm going to say no, even though that vaguely rings a bell.
You've probably heard of her. She's an American novelist and short story writer. She was recently on the show that I work on, and I had never heard of her.
Oh, that's how she rings a bell, because you talked about when she was on there.
Oh, did I? So she's won the MacArthur Genius Grant, and most of her books, I think, qualify as weird fiction. She reminds me of Elvia Wilk here, because there was no point where it seemed like Karen Russell was aware of this larger body of work that's more associated with horror. She was thinking more along the lines of like literary fiction, but she was writing pretty weird stuff. And as I saw my colleagues try to describe her work to one another, they would use the term weird. They'd be like, yeah, she's real weird. but I don't think they knew that they were talking about weird fiction, you know?
So when magical realism makes you feel uncomfortable,
yeah, right.
then you start approaching weird.
Mm-hmm.
And Wilk talks more about that, saying that discomforting implication of the limits of the human mind and the potential dissolution of the category humanity,
humanity with a capital H,
makes Lovecraft's fiction seem like a precursor to the contemporary awareness of the Anthropocene age.
That's interesting, right?
Yeah, here we are.
Yeah.
If Mark Fisher is in some ways an anti-capitalist scholar, right, who found himself concerned with the weird and the eerie in narrative, where did that sharp turn come from, right? Mm-hmm. But it comes from an attempt to grapple with the feeling that this is a world that is not supposed to exist, or the state of the world now was not meant to be, and yet we are making it happen.
Yeah.
How do you produce a narrative that provides people ways to think about that? Think about the death of the ecosphere.
I think Fisher, without really getting at it in this book, was approaching an idea that weird fiction was the best way to talk about the problems of capitalism through symbolism, right? Without being highbrow, without resorting to like super deep theory or Marxist philosophy. He was like, oh, there's something here. Like this seems like it, you know, everybody's gravitating to this H.P. Lovecraft. Maybe there's a way to kind of use this. And yeah, that's one of the big takeaways for me, is that weird fiction is about expressing a dissatisfaction with reality.
Yes. Wilk talks a little more about that. Fictions are important because they provide points of access through the human technology of the story to gigantic ecosystems made of humans and non-humans alike. This reconciliation of vastly different scales is necessary at a time when we are so aware of the magnitude of humanity's negative effects, and yet as individuals we struggle to make tangible ecosystemic contact. Or, to put it another way, as theorist Wendy Chun has put it, you can't experience the climate, you can only experience the weather.
Yeah.
You can't experience the death of the planet due to climate change. You can only experience your sense of, I think I don't know what's happening. People say that it's not true. People say that it's true. This was a super fucking hot September, but also I don't want to get caught by anecdotal evidence. I don't know. There's plastic in the water. What's happening? Is this my fault? I think it is, but it shouldn't be. Oh my God, how do I understand this terror that I am experiencing?
It's kind of interesting too, right? Because like she's using Lovecraftian terms to talk about climate change. For instance, like when she started talking about gigantic ecosystems, as it was interesting. As I was reading the sentences, I thought to myself, "Oh, here we go. We're going to talk about Cthulhu or the city of Relay under the sea or whatever, right?" And in actuality, she was saying, like, no, these actual literal ecosystems that are too big for us to wrap our heads around.
She references Cthulhu. She says, you know, the horror of the archaic sea creature coming back to claim its due is a narrative too easy to map onto our current moment. She's not concerned with the details of a Lovecraftian elder god, but she does recognize that if you think about weird fiction and its tropes or its and its imagery, it does seem to relate to the way we're trying to understand current fears,
the larger like institutional forces that we're up against, that like whether that's political, government, climate, you know, financial, economic, educational, all of these things that seem so much bigger than ourselves that we have a really hard time talking about. It's almost like weird fiction makes that easier.
Yeah. She goes on to try to really like parse the understanding of utopia and dystopia as these sort of standards for how you write fiction. and how neither utopian or dystopian fiction seems to be exactly a solution to how we're thinking right now about the world.
Hey, before we get into this quote of hers, I think we need to reiterate something that we talked about on a mini episode recently.
Okay.
Because not all of our listeners will have heard us talk about it. So we were talking about how you're reading more of Fisher's work and that you read Capitalist Realism. And I said, does he bring up that big Frederick Jameson quote in there? And you said yes. And that is perfectly applicable to what she's getting at here.
So here's the quote. Frederick Jameson actually backed off from it too, because he didn't say that he said it. He said, someone once said, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism.
Right. So therefore, all our dystopian imaginings are how we are struggling to deal with the idea of the ultimate like end point of capitalism.
And
right?
This is what we were talking about with Dollhouse, that Joss Whedon having sort of the same society, the same rules with chaos inside them, as opposed to some kind of revolution that actually changes the rules of society, is this kind of narrow and almost conservative view of how society will transform.
Yeah, that we couldn't possibly... the same thing could be applied to superhero fiction, right? Like there's an argument that goes something like this. Like Superman could very easily make the world a utopia. Why are none of the stories about Superman about him living in a world that's a utopia because he's used his powers to make the world perfect? Because we literally can't imagine that. So anyways, all of this sets us up for Wilk,
who says, in trying to construct a future imaginary that neither glorifies dystopia nor reaches blindly toward utopia, in a way that neither explains everything or gives up on explanation, we can't go on fighting or fleeing or attempting to understand according to current frameworks.
Okay.
So that's just a statement of, look, we have to do something different, and not something different, but still playing by the rules of what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't know why, but the example that I keep coming back to is Mad Max Fury Road, right? Like, it's a fun movie, and most people would argue that it's not intellectual, that there's barely any dialogue, and it's just car chases and guns going off and punching, right? But it is yet another example of an imagined dystopian apocalypse because of climate change, because of economic collapse. And that seems more believable to us than the belief that we can somehow surpass those systems and come up with a better way in which everybody would be happy.
Yeah. Or simply take away the kind of the capitalist frame that operates around, say, the free market, and start talking about value being extracted or invented, through the assessment or destruction of resources, et cetera, et cetera. I start to bore myself when I start talking this way, because I'm still trying to figure this stuff out. Like I know that capitalism and socialism are very hip these days to talk about, and I think that anybody who starts from the place of, capitalism is the only way that we can do anything, it's raised all these people out of poverty. It is the best way to distribute goods and services and to keep people happy. So just look at North Korea and you'll know capitalism is the only way.
This is the standard like dinner table argument against AOC right now.
Yeah. And then socialism, like, we must have a revolution. Bernie Sanders is the only person who should be president. And, all those people who think that we have to pay for anything are just mindlessly destroying any possibility of peace and happiness.
And
I can't really handle either one of those.
Yeah. There's some middle ground that needs to be approached there. Yeah.
And then everybody calls me an asshole for being a centrist. So I just don't.
Hey,
I don't engage.
Look, Joe Biden, I'm sorry. I don't know if you watched SNL last week, but they had this pretty funny joke about Joe Biden where he said like something like, I feel like I'm kind of like plastic straws. Like everybody liked me and I was very convenient. And then all of a sudden I was the bad guy.
God, that's brilliant. Yeah. Okay. So let's move on to Eugene Thacker, who we mentioned before. Now, Eugene Thacker, this is kind of fun. I met him because he taught at Georgia Tech.
I didn't know that, really.
Yeah, I had like 2 conversations with him. I'm sure he would not remember who I was, but he donated the Merzbow box set to WREK, which was
totally makes
awesome.
sense. Yeah.
I really liked him when I met him and talked to him. And he wrote a book called In the Dust of This Planet that was mentioned in the True Detective sort of popularity spike.
Yeah. Now that is a intellectual book that has made its way into the consciousness of some of these weird fiction writers.
Yeah, but mostly just summaries of it and then the title. Thacker is very interesting. So he's published by Zero Books, and maybe he has another one on Repeater, but Zero Books published his Horror of Philosophy. Not Philosophy of Horror, but his Horror of Philosophy series. And he really is trying to engage this question about the world for humanity, the world without humanity, and the world post-humanity. These sort of 3 sets of ideas we have, you know, when we try and think about the end of capitalism, the end of the world, you know, and the world itself without people, which then is kind of the frame of his review of the weird and the eerie.
Yeah, so he approaches it, and he starts off by talking about horror as a genre, and he says, the horror genre has not generally been considered worthy of critical, let alone philosophical reflection. People think of it as the stuff of cheap thrills and pulp magazines and B-movies, and much of this has changed in the ensuing years. Now we've got this robust, diverse critical literature that's emerged around horror, much of which not only considers the genre as a reflection of society, but as an autonomous platform for posing far-reaching questions that are concerned with the fate of the human species, the species that is named itself.
Yeah, see, that's a Thackerism right there. And then he says there's a lot of attempts to kind of listicle horror, to try and analyze it in terms of rankings or surveys or even opaque academic monographs of Lacanian psychoanalytic semiotic readings of horror film that themselves seem to be part of some kind of academic cult.
That's very Zizekian right there.
Yeah, yeah. So then he puts Mark Fisher's The Weird and the Eerie up against that sort of backdrop, saying that not being a popular book or an academic book might find us a sort of third space of discourse. Quote, one book that takes up this challenge is Mark Fisher's The Weird and the Eerie, published this year. He references K-Punk. Then he says, what Fisher's study shares with other like-minded books is an interest in expanding our understanding of the horror genre beyond the genre itself. And he does this by focusing on one of the deepest threads in the horror genre, the limits of human beings living in a human-centric world.
This is a thing that I hear often from folks who I talk to who either write weird fiction or are really into weird fiction, that they're almost like kind of embarrassed by its relationship to horror. And they're like, oh, I'm not really into some of that stuff, you know, like...
Yeah, I don't like vampires.
Yeah, or like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, no thank you. You know, and there's this attempt to try to be a little bit like, no, like what I do is weird fiction, like think Shirley Jackson, you know, like they're trying to come up with examples of literary folks who are adjacent to horror.
Yeah. And Thacker points out that horror sometimes gets kind of excused by a therapeutic urge or a cathartic urge.
Which we've talked about a lot
Yeah,
recently.
totally.
Yeah.
This is inoculation or, fear catharsis or, some kind of practice with the bad emotions.
Yes.
Right? That's the Stephen King thing. So Thacker tries to point out Mark Fisher's attempt to get us away from therapy or catharsis as the point of horror, but instead a way to spark thoughts in our head that will allow us to approach concepts that are hard to grasp, hard to articulate, and maybe even difficult to contemplate because of their transgressive nature or dismal nature.
I think in a way you're talking about inspiration, but it doesn't, our English definition of inspiration doesn't fully cover what you need right there.
Yeah. So Thacker suggests that there's a progressive sort of understanding of horror that, the world changes and it's better. There's a conservative sort of understanding of horror that the world must be returned to its previous state despite the thing that has encroached upon it.
Yeah, right. That we always have to... Yeah, that's Jason goes after kids who are having sex in the barn. The Old Testament horror.
So then he says, whether reactionary or progressive, both responses to the horror genre involve a strategy in which the world in all its strangeness is transformed into a world made in our own image or a world rendered useful for us as human beings. There's a humanism at the core of horror that is not this kind of weird fiction, this weird horror, this cosmic horror, right? So he says the insight of books like Fisher's is that the horror genre is also capable of chipping away at this species-specific sovereignty, taking aim at the twin pillars of anthropomorphism, which is a world made in our own image, and anthropocentrism, which is a world rendered useful for us as human beings. Instead of being concerned with species self-interest and mastery, such horror stories tend more towards humility, hubris, and even in its darkest moments, futility. This is the Junji Ito of it all, and also the reason that I feel like there's religion floating in weird horror for the atheist.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up. I just used the term Old Testament to talk about that one kind of horror. Stephen King, another way that he talks about the usefulness of horror is he talks about horror writers as sin eaters.
Yes.
In that, we take it upon ourselves as to write these stories, to absorb these, kind of like shamanism. Like we're absorbing some kind of bad disease, that is floating around, a miasma in the air of humanity. And then by capturing it within these stories, we're able to purge it somehow.
Yeah. And yet the weird or the eerie is more about recognizing that thing,
right,
without purging.
Yeah, it exists, and you just have to recognize that it does, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's very AA. I have to accept the things that I cannot change,
and thus be protected from them in a way. Mm-hmm. But then Thacker says the weird and the eerie are inseparable from the fabric of the social, cultural, and political landscape in which we are embedded. Right? You cannot escape them. They are inevitable. And then he quotes Fisher against that. Capital is at every level an eerie entity. Conjured out of nothing, capital nevertheless exerts more influence than any allegedly substantial entity. Yeah. So this is where suddenly capitalist realism and the weird and the eerie become part of the same cultural theory discourse. Mm-hmm. And we understand now, the man-made world, or the assumption of the human-centric world, can be understood with this sort of new cosmic horror. Just like Lovecraft was saying,
Mm-hmm.
I'm writing about the realization that the universe doesn't care about us. Weird fiction can be an attempt to write about the idea that what I thought the world was turns out to be my own assumptions
Yeah.
that are now killing me.
I don't want to go like too far down this road, but this is very close to the kind of stuff that I wrote about in my academic thesis during my studies, because I was writing about the limits of understanding nationality and ideology within a particular nation. Two things that if you tell people they're imaginary, they get real defensive real quick: money and countries. Like if you say, you know that the United States is an imagined thing, right? And that the line between the United States and Canada and the line between the United States and Mexico is imaginary. It's just something we all made up.
Yeah, you're supposed to use the word constructed so it doesn't sound like you're dismissing it.
But boy, does that get people either confused or really upset real quick. And I think similarly what Thacker and Fisher are approaching here is talking about money in the same way. Like, you realize like we're all just playing with monopoly money. This is all made up.
I was driving through a neighborhood near to mine where the houses are much more expensive.
Yeah.
And the houses in my neighborhood and the houses in that neighborhood used to be the same price, same average price. But we've just decided, we've agreed that the value of those houses over there is much higher. It's like printing money in a way. It's just a made up change in worth.
If you can convince enough people, enough of the right people, that something has more value than it used to, then you're essentially printing money.
Yeah. And it's also, on the other hand, it's a free market, right? This is what people are going to sell it for.
Mm-hmm.
And in between that kind of literal truth, someone is going to say, yes, that works for me. Let's enact the ritual so that I can now live here.
Yeah.
And oh my God, it's all just made up. It's all just, in there is this kind of indescribable, inscrutable, ineffable discomfort.
Yeah, exactly. It makes you uncomfortable. Most people wouldn't think of it as horror, right? But the discomfort that you experience when you're told, like, you know, you don't actually live in a country, right? Or you know that none of this is real. Like, at any point, all of this could fall apart. There's the existential dread that's involved in that. Not everybody thinks of that as horror.
Right. And to go along with that, for me, I mean, I feel very vulnerable even talking a little bit about this. Like, I know that most of our listeners are supportive of this project. But I also feel like any minute now that there'll be an email about someone who thinks that I am an idiot, right?
Well, I would just say I would try to look at it from the positive direction. A lot of our listeners are academics that are far more learned than we are in these specific areas of information. And so
that's what I'm saying. I don't want them to call me an idiot.
You're always worried about who's going to call you an idiot. I think they're going to contribute to the conversation.
God, I hope so. On patreon.com/supercontext, right?
There you go. That was a nice bit of the free market right there, my friend.
I'm just trying to make it okay that I'm sort of feeling more and more anti-capitalist, but I still like money and stuff.
Well, welcome to postmodernism, Charlie.
Yeah, welcome to the Eerie. I think we can bring this in for a landing by returning to Luckhurst, who I dismissed his sort of his facile imagery about goths and horror, but he does give us a place to land. He says about the weird and the eerie, this book is more than just a roadmap to this kind of material. It is an important critical intervention because it intends to carefully delineate a spectrum of sensibilities, the nuances of feeling that span the uneasy or the unnerving, that feeling of being off-kilter, of wrongness, or free-floating angst.
You know, I think something that's interesting here, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you and I were talking about politics off air before we started recording this episode. And we were both talking about how I'm not going to use specific examples because they won't be relevant in a week, much less
this
a
shit's
year.
going to change by the time anybody hears this.
But we're just both feeling very alienated from the world and how crazy everything is. And I think a lot of people are experiencing the weird because of current events recently, and they don't like it. And this is kind of what Fisher and other people were building up to, is like, hey, like, we can tackle these big problems. We can talk about these through this style of fiction.
Right. There needs to be a way to feel at least comfortable with your understanding of your discomfort when it comes to stuff like feeling off-kilter, wrong, or angsty because you are using your phone.
Yeah, right?
Or because you're thinking about political machinations that you never should have had revealed to you, right? You know, I'm very old man yelling at cloud in this moment, but I feel like the 12-hour cooling off period for, when you got your news was better.
I don't know if it's better. I think it's just different.
For your
right?
mental health.
Oh, yeah, that could be true.
I mean, the actual movement in activism, lobbying, social change, the ability to organize quickly and respond, yes, that's all very good. But I am feeling crazy because I have to figure out what happened when people start doing like ironic statements on Twitter.
Or you have to feel like you suddenly need to pack 3 years worth of law school and constitutional scholarship into an afternoon just so you can understand how you're supposed to feel about the world right now.
Yeah. Who do I trust to explain to me what law was broken by this fucking thing? So Luckhurst gives us some language for that too. He uses some Fisher quotes to sum up. The uncanny, Fisher says, puts the strange within the familiar and operates by always processing the outside through the gaps and impasses of the inside. In other words, and this is still Luckhurst, for all its interest in boundary breaches, it is still centered on the self. The weird and the eerie work at this from the other direction, Fisher suggests. They allow us to see the inside from the perspective of the outside.
There you go. So that's something that I think that's a much better way to describe what you and I have been circling around for the last hour. That we're able to see the inside from the perspective of the outside.
And that's a little bit about getting outside your bubble, right? But it's also a little bit about not imagining that you are an individual who is being put upon by forces that are considering you their object.
Yeah.
But instead recognizing, the larger scene of which you are a piece, right? That your individual responses and reactions are not the sole purpose of that which is happening.
But just let's stick with this metaphor for a second here. Just the very act of doing that, it makes many human beings so incredibly uncomfortable that they resist it and withdraw, right? Imagine this. Imagine you're a fish in an aquarium in somebody's living room.
Okay, give me 1 second. Got it.
And then somebody says to you, hey, put on these goggles, fish. These goggles are going to let you see the world from the perspective of outside of the fish tank that you exist inside of. And you're seeing yourself and the entire ecosystem of the fish tank around you that you've never understood up until that point.
Let me ask you a question. Do you know if fish can vomit? Because I think that's what I would end up doing.
See? Yeah. It automatically, just the very idea of that makes you go, ugh, geez, like that's uncomfortable. And that's what we're trying to ask our fellow human beings to do with these kind of stories.
Yeah, I had it today. There's like just a moment when a different understanding of how basically how economic forces are not influenced by my actions, but instead guide them. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. And I just started to kind of have that feeling, and I just started to feel a little bit vertiginous. I just slightly dizzy, and then I snapped back. It's like, okay, no, I'm okay. But yeah, I'm trying to think about this stuff, and it's discomforting.
Yeah, it resists interpretation, and I think Fisher gets that. I think Thacker gets that. I think now this is where I'm gonna get on my pedestal for a second here. I think though what would be useful is if the people continuing, taking the baton from Fisher here, were able to interact with the masterful storytellers that are working within this genre, and they were able to use that to produce something that's even more useful to get us all to understand how to look inside the aquarium from the outside.
So we've had a few moments in the show, not this episode, but in the show broadly, where we've tried to figure out a taxonomy of work, especially in the horror genre, based on what some writers, some creators have laid out as, there's 2 kinds or there's 3 kinds, right?
Right.
And so Fisher has given us another sort of set of possibilities. We've talked about Stephen King, who said there's horror, terror, and gore.
Yeah.
Right. Can you give your quick summation of those 3?
This is the way King describes it. Terror is being afraid of what's behind the door without seeing it. Horror is letting the door open a little bit and seeing briefly what's behind it. And gore is letting the door swing all the way open and just pouring a bucket of blood on somebody's head, on your head. The other way that he approaches this in Danse Macabre is he says, well, horror literature is defined by, what is it, the werewolf, the vampire, and the thing that should not be.
Right.
And my problem with that is always, you forgot about the weird. For a guy who's such an adherent to Lovecraft, he completely neglects to define what's going on there.
Well, he lumps it in with the thing that should not be, right? And he's a boomer. Mm-hmm. So there's a certain gap in how he thinks of things.
Right. Well, he grew up with the Universal horror movies too, right? Yeah.
Stephen Graham Jones tried to distinguish between permanent and temporary literature, which is kind of like the difference between literature and pulp. But what he was really sort of going after is there's some stuff that stays with us and can be revisited.
So like, let me see if I can come up with a quick example that's more universal. True Detective is permanent, whereas Law and Order is temporary.
I think you might be giving True Detective a little more weight, but yes, like that. And so where can we find, what can we find in Fisher?
So Fisher is giving us definitions for these terms, weird and eerie. And not everybody was asking for a definition of eerie, but a lot of people were saying, like, we need to figure out how to define weird. All those people we quoted at the beginning of this episode were trying to put their stamp on it. And Fisher seems to have come up with a pretty succinct way of doing that by using the eerie as, like, the other side of the coin of the weird to help us understand the weird better.
Yeah, and so Fisher might give us a way to think about, does horror fiction allow a person to practice or exercise feelings that they've already had, be that terror or horror, or does it try to articulate for them feelings or fears they haven't had yet?
You've been listening to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How it's made and how it informs our everyday culture.
Our theme music is Human Factor by Mile Marker.
And right now, you're listening to Drive Fast by 3 Chain Links.
Show notes and all our past episodes are available at supercontextpodcast.libsyn.com.
You can email the show at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com to tell us what you like, what you don't like, and to suggest topics for future shows.
And I'm available on Twitter as @Christian Sager.
And I'm there @Bennett Radio. 2 N's, 2 T's.